do have skills that make me a nightmare for people like you.
Thank you, Madam Registrar. Mrs. Spellman.
Thank you, sir. Our next witness is Professor Elizabeth Stanley.
Dr. Stanley, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Can I ask you, in terms of the Inquiries Act 2013, as you commence, you solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence you will give before this Commission will be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth?
I will.
Thank you. Ms. Spellman.
Thank you, sir. Tēnā koe, Professor Stanley. If I could ask you just to check on the document in front of you, that's your brief that's signed on the last page, on page 20?
Yes.
And for you to confirm that that statement is correct to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes.
And before we begin, just to thank you for your patience today with our somewhat changing timetable. We're very appreciative that you're here to give your evidence.
Thank you.
If you could, for those who won't be familiar, just tell us a little about your background, and in particular the book that you wrote on this topic, just to provide some context before we dive in.
Yeah, so about 10 years ago, I started work on examining abuse in state care, particularly social welfare institutions. And my background, I'm a criminologist and I'm interested in state crimes generally. And I'm always interested in how we might deal with mass human rights violations. And I saw that this was an ultimate example of mass human rights violations, and a state that was at the time in almost total denial that these things were happening, had happened, the impacts on people's lives, and everything. So I started working in the area, and I took my time. It took me about 7 years to produce the book, which is called The Road to Hell.
The book you wrote, The Road to Hell, I understand that tells the story of 105 New Zealanders.
That's right.
Is that right?
Yeah.
And it's focused on what they experienced in state care.
Yeah, how they got into state care, what they experienced while they were in state care, the legacies of abuse on their lives, their re-victimisation as they tried to come forward with claims.
And we'll get into some details of that book as we travel through, but I just wanted to ask you at the outset about how you use names within the book, just to be clear for those who might be listening when we refer to particular names.
Yeah, so when I approached everybody, obviously I got consent from all 105, and I asked what name they would like in the book, and some of them chose their own name and others chose pseudonyms.
And so when we're referring to names today, it'll be a mixture of made-up names and real names to protect the identity of those who don't want to be publicly identified.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to begin by asking you about what the topic in your brief is, overview of abuse and neglect, and firstly just to touch on the prevalence of physical and sexual abuse that you encountered in terms of the people that you interviewed.
Yeah, so of the 105 New Zealanders in the book, 91 suffered serious physical violence at the hands of staff in institutional care. And everybody in the book witnessed that kind of violence, and I think that's something we all need to be mindful of as well, in terms of witnessing physical violence can be seen to be even more impactful sometimes on individuals than experiencing it. So I think over the last week and today, people have spoken quite a bit about physical violence, and I think that systemic violence within the institutions, it emerged from a few things. It emerged from a reliance on staff to use violence as a means of asserting control trying to build compliance, actually trying to toughen children up. Some of the violence within the workforces at Aotearoa, for example, was undertaken to try and toughen children up and prepare them for the real world. As punishments, obviously, and as a form of deterrence as well, to try and indicate to children why they shouldn't return to the institutions. Of course, they had no choice in that, really. I think that those were the fundamental factors on why staff used violence so readily, and why violence wasn't necessarily challenged by bystander staff as well. So violence, physical violence was endemic. It emerged through cruel or unusual punishments. So 70 people in the book talked about cruel or unusual punishments that really went beyond policy for the time. You know, they were really, it wasn't just this is what happened in those days. It was progressing beyond that. And again, you know, issues like standing on a line in Otago in the middle of winter in a singlet and shorts, you know, those things were pretty common. Moving wheelbarrows of sand from one part of Hokio Beach to another, and having locals watch children and shame them even further was another.
Dr. Stanley, Judge Shaw and I have both conferred saying the same thing. We're having a little bit of difficulty hearing you.
Oh, okay.
Perhaps with the assistance of our technical staff, we could adjust the microphone.
I can talk up though.
That would be that. Thank you. They're already saying it's better. So thank you.
I'll do my lecture ahead. Yeah. So people talked about those cruel or unusual punishments. Obviously, the use of ECT as a form of punishment for individuals, discussed how they were taken for ECT, and that wasn't as a result of a mental health diagnosis. It emerged as a form of punishment because people were running away or they were acting up. Not doing their homework was one reason, and actually you can track some of those things through the files. In terms of the kingpin hierarchy, again, that's been well discussed today, so I don't really want to talk about that very much. It was clear that staff used the kingpin hierarchy as a means to control the institutions, and in many ways, left unprotected, children had no choice but to harden up and to use violence themselves. So victims became bullies, and on it progressed. In terms of sexual violence, 57 of the 105 people in my study were sexually assaulted by adults. And there are a number of those individuals who were repeatedly victimised by those adults. Children were also sexually assaulted by other children. 48 of the 105 were sexually assaulted by another child. I think one of the things that Sonia Cooper and Amanda Hill touched on this morning was we do often look at the acts of physical and sexual violence and see those as being indicative of abuse, but I also think that one of the main things that came out of my research has been more around the neglect and the psychological violence directed towards children. And I talk in the book about the daily denigrations, basically, that children endured, that were part of the everyday administration of the care system, and were the things that weren't necessarily headline news. They were just the drip, drip, drip of abuse, and that led people to lose a sense of themselves, led people to lose all self-esteem, and actually in the long term, for many people, these have been the things that are the most difficult things to shift, and have been experienced as the most harmful. Often people talk about these things as the most harmful things because they're really hard to get past. So in my statement, I highlight a few intangible harms that were done to children. So the first one I talk about is isolation. And isolation techniques were used extensively in the institutions. We can see it very clearly in terms of the use of secure cells. In my study, 86 respondents spent more than 3 days in secure cells, and a significant number spent weeks, months at a time in secure cells. And obviously these were small, Spartan, dehumanizing places. There was no comfort. Bedding and mattresses were removed during the day. Excessive physical training dominated. Mind games dominated. Children insecure didn't have any access to visitors. They often didn't have any access to things to read, things to do, no hobbies. So being insecure was basically an exercise in coping with isolation. And it was something that caused a great deal of fear. When people talk about it, often I saw people just go right back to that point in their lives. In some secure units, like Oairaka in the 1970s, they had the nodding system. So children were not allowed to speak. They couldn't look out the window. They couldn't keep a clock. They couldn't sing. And every communication was through nodding.
In terms of the social isolation, I wanted to ask you about the experience for Māori children in particular that you've touched on in your brief in terms of what that meant being kept away from family, whānau, and everything that comes with that.
Yeah.
What was the experience of those in your study?
Yeah, it was massive. It was unbearable for people. Māori all talk. Well, I think everybody talked about the dehumanizing effects and how they, from these isolation techniques like secure, that people shut down, they were afraid, all of those things. Beyond that, the isolation also emerged because social connections were regarded as a privilege. And children had to earn their right to a human need. And obviously for Māori children who were in monocultural institutions and then utterly isolated from whānau, hapu, iwi, marae, every cultural mooring taken away. It was just another layer on top. And of course the impacts of this has just been intergenerational. The loss has been intergenerational, and it has impacted across every aspect of life, across health, across criminal justice, across education. And of course, as Mr. Taito pointed out, it wasn't just Māori as well. Pacific children had that same loss, similar loss.
And we've heard about the lack of facilitation of keeping in contact with family. And I just note one example from your brief in terms of children not being notified of significant events, including the death of a parent. Was that one of the examples of someone in your study?
Yeah, that was Taiti, and basically Taiti had gone from an institution to a family home for a bit of a holiday, and on his way there was told by a social worker who met him from the bus that his mother had died, and that was some time before, and that was the first he'd heard of it. Just such a devastating experience.
Another aspect of the daily denigrations, as you put them, was what amounted to emotional neglect.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah. It really stems from verbal abuse, largely, and the use of horrendous labels, names being placed on children by staff, how children were treated with contempt, Maori and Pacifica children in particular. And children, one thing as criminologists we know, in terms of how labels are internalised, and children did internalise those labels. They lost self-esteem and respect. They began to think of themselves as trouble. They were told, children would be sat down to watch a video of a prison and told, this is where you're going when you grow up. And they began to believe that narrative of their lives. This is what I have to prepare for. And beyond that, the emotional neglect was also exacerbated by public stigma towards children in care. I've met a lot of people since who've talked about, living near a Puni and saying, I could never, we were never allowed to even look at the children who were in a Puni. This is where all the bad kids were. And you can see that replicated around the country, and ideas of who state care kids are and what they are, and that they are stigmatised. And that's also part of the reason why it's often so difficult for people to come forward, because survivors say, when you tell someone that I was in state care, people, Ray Wynn in the book says, people do a 360. And they begin to see you in a totally different light. They begin to wonder, what did she do? Yeah, those things are very difficult to shake.
And how about the educational neglect that you've described?
Yeah. For the most part, the institutions fail to provide children with an even basic education. There were low expectations about children's academic abilities. They were seen as not really deserving of an education. 1982, the department provided approximately 3 to 5 books per institution. In Hokio, between 1972 to 77, 22 teachers arrived and left for long periods. There were no teachers. And that kind of experience was, that was maybe a bit extreme, but that thing of having institutions that had no schools was quite common. And of course, the state was removing children from families because children had truanted or were seen to be at risk of truanting. Nanette, for example, she was picked up and placed into care because she hadn't attended school for a little while, and then she got into the institutions and there was no education. And of course that has such a significant long-term impact. It impacts on everything and people's opportunities for employment, and absolutely everything across every aspect of life. Yeah.
And we might come back to that point in terms of the long-term legacies. But in terms of the next point in your brief, controlling bodies, we have heard some evidence last week about the checks that were done in the girls' home on admission. But are there some other points in terms of controlling bodies that you'd like to highlight?
Yeah, I suppose the main thing would be around how children were continually humiliated. So the control of bodies, whether that was about children having to be submissive, sitting at tables, prim and proper, hands on lips, that bodily submission, how girls endured obviously very damaging gynecological examinations on arrival, how children would be inducted into the institutions and stripped and deloused and placed in communal clothing or placed into pyjamas because they were at risk of absconding. So if you put them in pyjamas, they're less likely to abscond. How staff controlled access to toilets, controlled access to toilet paper, controlled access to sanitary pads, the use of medication, again not necessarily for medical needs, but to quell children who might be acting up. Yeah. So I suppose in terms of those daily denigrations, what my research really showed was that there are these mundane legacies of institutional life that are, as I said, that have massively negative impacts. The use of medications, for example, sets some people up for raging drug habits, for example. So they have overwhelmingly negative impacts, and respondents constantly talked about the stress of being continually belittled by the adults around them, frustration at not receiving a proper education, their struggle to gain friends outside the institution, the despair in not having unconditional love, their loss of autonomy, continual feelings of insecurity, never knowing if they'll ever see their family again, because some staff would say, this is it now. You're in here, you'll go to another institution, then you're in prison. So all of those things have had extraordinary impacts on so many New Zealanders. And I think part of the emphasis that I wanted to give in writing about those things was to detail and for us to remember that a lot of these things are still very much part of our care system. They're still part of our justice system. They're the things that are maybe a bit more difficult to shift. But they're very much alive.
Thank you, Professor. The next point, really, as you know, we've heard some evidence already in terms of the types of abuse and neglect, and it's been very helpful to hear your evidence on that today. The next part, I suppose, is the question of how this happened and how it was allowed to happen for such a long time. And I know in terms of your research, you've looked at the bigger picture in terms of the framework and the structures that allowed such things to go on. Could you talk us through that?
Yeah. So the research really demonstrates that the often used arguments that it's about apples or individuals that sustain abusive environments is kind of out the window, Yeah, we can't take those kind of arguments at all. And I think, one of the questions has been around how this abuse came to be so stridently normalised, in terms of the cultures of the places, and how individuals might come in and see something being wrong, but nothing shifts, essentially. And so the structural frameworks are really important to identify. And obviously there are institutional cultures that allowed domination and violence to occur, but there was also a real culture of impunity. And so what my work really shows is just how institutions, some institutions responded at times to complaints, and certain people might be moved to another institution, certain staff members might be moved to another institution, or they'd be let go, but often there wasn't anything on their records. Some people would be, the police might be called occasionally, and some people were convicted at the time. But essentially, institutions generally ignored complaints, and a real focus on ensuring legitimacy for institutions and maintaining the marketing, I suppose. So what my work identifies were a few factors that really acted as barriers to abuse being detected or stopped. So the first one was at the level of the perpetrators, of adult perpetrators, and how they operated effectively. So sexual offenders would groom children and give children lollies, allow children to have holiday leave, and kind of protected them a little bit, and gaining their trust as a means to then abuse them and to try and ensure that they wouldn't help. And of course, beyond that kind of grooming, there were also threats. So some children were told, if you don't do what I want you to do, then you're never getting out of here, and you will not see your parents again. So you have that level of the adult perpetrators and their techniques. And then, of course, a lot of children, having been denigrated for so long within the institutions, they thought, well, I'm not going to be believed. I'm a state ward. Who am I going to tell? Who's going to believe me? You're made out to be the troublemaker, so you're on the back foot. So children felt, and often would self-censor as a consequence of that. A lot of children also felt quite ashamed of their victimisation. They internalised their abuse. They worried about their complicity. They began to fret about their sexuality, and they feared retributions. They feared punishments if they spoke. Some children, having come from families that had been violent, wouldn't necessarily even recognise the violence that they'd been subjected to in state care. They didn't, it's just, this is normal, a normal victimisation. Beyond that, so they kind of level out from those individuals, you've obviously got the issue of the narking culture that really, institutions didn't tolerate narcs, they didn't tolerate complainants. Staff would sometimes point out children who would complain about minor matters, and they would see that child then get beaten. So narcs could be punished by staff and other residents. So there was that cultural aspect. There was also the issue that bystander staff often didn't intervene in the face of even in the face of clear evidence of assaults. I think 45 children in the book tried to complain at the time. So it's not that children were totally silent. There were a lot of attempts to tell, and workers often told them that they were lying. They didn't necessarily believe them. They blamed the child for the beating or the assault. People talked about, well, you're here because you're bad and you've got to expect a bit of a beating. What did you think this was going to be like, a holiday camp? It's kind of that response. And then on top of that, you've got the institutional protectionism, and how institutions try to stage manage themselves as reasonable places. So people talked about how after having received quite a significant beating, that they then were taken on this odd day out, and they had a lovely time outside the institution fishing, and then they kind of returned back to the institution and they've realised, there was a monitoring group coming through. So they were taken off the premises, removed from the premises. Other people spoke about how they knew when a group was coming through because all their T-shirts would be changed and all of a sudden they'd get lollies for the day. So that kind of institutional marketing was very much in operation. And I suppose all of those things, they compounded to teach children that there was no safety, there was no protection for them. And added to that institutional impunity was upheld through the files as well. Like one of the, certainly the worst aspect of writing the book was going through case files. They are pretty much uniformly negative. They focus on children's delinquencies, their deficits, their inability to do things, the problems with their families, their psychological troubles. There's like next to nothing in case files about children's good points, about how they might be kind, how they might try and do well in their education, how they might have particular strengths, or any aspect of their being that is positive is not recorded. And within that, when you have this whole system that's magnifying unruly behaviours, personal deficits, these things confirm the stereotypes of the risky children in care. And added to that, of course, files rarely mention abuse or ill treatment against children. Even when people were convicted, there's often no record of it in particular in children's files. So all of these things are legitimised over decades. They legitimise the institutions. And I thought one thing that was really clear from my work was about how people become manacled to their files. Like once those social welfare files were in operation, you can basically track how the same language and the same stories about children are replicated from social welfare into justice, corrections, health, because there's a lot of cutting and pasting that goes on across these agencies, and these stories are just built up and up and up and up, and sometimes you can see exactly where a narrative about an individual and their psychological deficit emerges 20, 30 years later, you can kind of track back to see where that emerged in the social welfare system. And of course, all those things ensure impunity, because the target and the focus is on the children and what we should do to control this child, to treat them, to intervene in their families, all of those things.
Just on record keeping, we had a acknowledgement from the Crown at the beginning of this hearing that the Crown hasn't always been the best record keeper, and their record keeping was patchy. And I just wondered if you had a comment in terms of whether that is or can be seen in terms of poor practice perhaps, or something more systemic and deliberate in terms of the impunity that you've spoken about.
Yeah, I think certainly some institutions were better than others. I could say that. I think every institution has gaps in their registers and in their record keeping. Some institutions basically fell off the map in terms of record keeping. You'd have kind of the head office saying, we don't actually know what's going on at Weymouth. Like, we've not heard from them in ages. They don't file anything. Apparently, there's nothing going on there. They're not having anyone punished. It's just totally fallen off the map. So I think in that respect, there was at times a systemic lack of record keeping. And of course, since that time, as the Cooper legal team pointed out earlier, there's been an absolute loss in records as well. So I think a lot of records were quickly removed, destroyed, left on sites to flutter in the wind.
Another aspect of your evidence, and we've also heard about this from several witnesses already, is this idea of a care to custody pipeline or trajectory. And I know that it's an important point in your book to acknowledge that obviously this is not all people that were in care, and that many people in care went on to live law-abiding lives. But could you talk us through what your research showed in terms of the factors that compounded that trajectory?
I think the book was really clear in this aspect, and actually when I went to look at the international literature later, actually, because I developed the book just out of a lot of New Zealand material. When I went to look at the international literature later, a lot of it is really resonant in that international literature too. So there are several factors that underpin this care to custody trajectory. And I think what became really clear again was that it wasn't about necessarily the actions of individual children, adolescents, adults, care leavers. A lot of these things really emerged out of the system. So the first one was around histories of maltreatment, and clearly previous maltreatment within families or state care settings increased the likelihood of a person then progressing through to criminal justice attention. The second aspect was around multiple placements. This was really significant. In my research, 71 of the 105 spent time in both community and institutional placements. 42 experienced more than 3 placements. Some children experienced dozens of placements. And that, I mean, when we kind of think about moving house, what that entails and the stress of that, of moving and maybe making new friends in your new neighbourhood or meeting new work colleagues, and then you multiply it, as a child as well, to be moved in those conditions. So transfers removed emotional stability. Transfers meant that children felt that they didn't fit anywhere, that they were unlovable, that there was nowhere where they could settle. Placement changes meant that children were continually disconnected from family, whānau, former carers, from social workers who might have been fighting their corner at a particular point in time. It meant that they could never have, that educational aspect. They were constantly on the move, never settling for education. They stressed about fitting in their new home, about learning new placement rules. All of those aspects of multiple placements increases a sense of isolation for children. It increases their alienation, their insecurity, and it had all kinds of knock-on effects, particularly in terms of how children then progressed. They had no attachment to anything, so you didn't have anyone to look out for you. You didn't have anyone to live a different life for as well. Yeah. Added to that, of course, you've got institutional cultures and conditions. So children who are in institutional care are subject to the most peer pressure of any other group in society, probably. That kind of the level of peer pressure is so significant. And of course, within these institutions, you had a whole mix of children who were placed together. Very small children mixed in with older children, children who had been removed for care and protection being placed alongside children who'd already started to offend. You had all of that enmeshed. Added to that, within the institutions, we often talk now about care criminalisation and how children in care are quickly criminalised for things that in normal family life they wouldn't have to deal with. Of course, within the institutions, there's a lot of surveillance, there's a lot of monitoring. What you are doing is being written down, it's being recorded, and it's being built up as well. So there's this kind of idea, every little delinquent act that you do or that you're not following the rules, that will be noted and recorded. And at times, you'd have situations where, children might abscond for the day, turn up late, so they weren't there at lunchtime, but they'd turn up later at dinner time because they'd been kicking about outside, but the police had been called. Yeah, and so that then becomes they are an absconder. They're given that label of absconder, which you don't get when you're in in your family home. You don't get that at all. So you become, that is a delinquent act, and the police are called, and then their cards are further marked. So that care criminalisation is very significant. And of course, given the issues of how the institutions were criminogenic places, given kind of the peer pressure and the use of violence and everything else, those things very much kind of lead children onto that offending path, which is why we're seeing it so clearly in the evidence. So added to that, I think the fourth issue on the care to custody trajectory is, of course, around social disadvantages and also psychological harm, because on leaving care, children encountered and still encounter endemic disadvantages within society. As abused care leavers, the people in the book often talked about how they lacked an attachment to friends, family, whānau. These feelings coalesced with psychological harms, that respondents left care with long-term problems, a whole host of long-term problems, from things like poor sleep and intimacy problems, comes to being hypervigilant, not being able to be at peace in relationships, not trusting other people, using substances to self-medicate to try and block out bad memories. There's a whole host of psychological impacts. And of course, as they were transitioning out of care, as the narrative goes, you're transitioning out of care. They weren't really transitioning, they were shown the door and off they were. They obviously lacked the financial ability to live. They didn't have the know-how. They were largely uneducated, and so the story goes. And so all of the respondents talked about those long-term multiple disadvantages. And children, as a consequence, often sought protection from gangs, gave kind of some material comfort. 33 children in the book turned to gang life after care, and only a handful had gone into care with gang associations. So, and of course those burdens of disadvantages have been exacerbated for Maori, they've been exacerbated for Pacifica people, how those children were made to feel that Maori identity, Pacifica identities were something to shun. All of those, they've produced immeasurable intergenerational harms. So on top of that, on top of those disadvantages and harms, we've also got this idea that I pulled out in terms of how children became imprisonable. And I talk about two issues here. The first one is in terms of differential criminal justice responses, because once a child has been institutionalised, then officials are more likely to regard that child as being worthy of further incarceration. Once you have that record of being in an institution, it's seemingly easier for people to send people to prison. And we can see this replicated in international research. But obviously, if a child came before a court as an adult, child as an adult, but if they came to the court as an adult, they would obviously arrive in court with very lengthy case records. Again, very negative files. They would arrive with this whole list of things that why they were bad. And so their problems were magnified. And so children could be given custodial sentences on that basis because of their risk. They have long histories of delinquency and criminal acts, so they're seen as a risk. But they could also be given prison sentences as a consequence of it being seen that it was good for their welfare. Because they might be struggling on the outside, they might be sleeping on the street, and actually then it becomes a case of, well, we'll give you a short sentence and you can have some respite in a cell. Yeah. So I think those things were really clear in terms of how that differential criminal justice responses was directed to care leavers. And of course, within the work, it became clear that previously institutionalised girls and Maori children were especially disadvantaged in those court decision-making processes, because they were more likely to be viewed as being risky and in need of further containment. So there was that differential criminal justice response, and also that how children, adults, began to normalise their incarceration, because children also knew that they could do the time.
Just in terms of your last point about previously institutionalised girls and Māori children, was that also seen within whānau in terms of if an older sibling had a history and that was transferred, so to speak? Was that something that you came across in the research?
Yes. Yeah, for sure. And now when we look at kind of the risk factors that our criminal justice and welfare agencies are revolving around, a lot of these things are, kind of around past sentences, previous incarceration, family connection, kind of family involvement with agencies, poverty, lack of education, like all the crucial risk factors that allow decisions to, whether you're going to get a community sentence or custody, or you're going to get custody if you have those things ticked off. And of course, so you can see those things really very, very clearly. Yeah.
And then you were just going on to talk about the normalisation of incarceration as well.
Yeah. Because on leaving state care, children felt like they could do the time. They knew what it was to be in a cell. Often children, when they got out of care, life was hard. A lot of people went onto the streets. They struggled. Some people preferred a cell. There was a few boys in the book who had spent a long time insecure, and they struggled to be outside. So they became really institutionalized pretty quickly. And we can see that generally, in terms of how institutionalization operates and how it develops quite quickly, even in remand prisoners, actually, who are, on fairly short period, can be, they can be up to a year, less than, but, who will be on a more limited time. We can see that very clearly. So I think that normalisation also propels that care to custody trajectory. And as I said, these explanations are kind of found in international studies. And what's also important is that these aspects are also, again, reiterated in our current system, in our current welfare and criminal justice systems. Like everything I've just been talking about is still very much alive and well in our welfare and justice systems.
And so what you've been talking about in terms of those risks and the way that those risks are still framed and used, I know you wanted to discuss a little more about risk in terms of the way that it's framed currently and how that might need to shift. Could you talk us through that?
Yeah, I think this really has kind of emerged out of how my research has really shown that we need to be far more attentive to the risks of intervention and the risks of criminalisation and the risks of incarceration, the risks of removal, even that initial act of removal, the risk of that. Because obviously a lot of our risk narrative in contemporary terms is directed towards individuals. It's directed towards family and whānau. That is the whole structure of our risk assessment processes within welfare and criminal justice spheres. And what this work really demonstrated was that the risks were not really individual risks or family risks, whānau risks. They were really directed to the risks of state action, even state action that seemed to be benign. So now we have kind of we can see within our welfare and criminal justice agencies how risks are re-articulated, and they can be seen as being, well, we need to do this for a child's well-being. We need to do this for child's best interests. We need to do this because a child is vulnerable. Like there's a kind of sometimes quite a progressive language that's wrapped over risk. But what you can effectively see in the current strategies are elements of risk across welfare and criminal justice that are essentially the same. So if you're a vulnerable child, then you are at risk but you can also be very quickly labelled as the risk because your risk factors are the same. And so what we can see is that once you have those risk factors in place, that the preemptive interventions, which we're kind of moving towards so clearly now in our current systems, preemptive interventions will be very quickly directed to certain populations. And we know exactly who they are. And that's kind of one of the reasons why we've seen an increase in uplifts from Oranga Tamariki that are obviously directed to Maori families. We can see them in terms of kind of the ways in which our criminal justice system is being directed to preemptive interventions towards families on the basis that a child might offend in the future, and what a lot of international research is telling us now, there's a really great study by Makara and McGvee, a longitudinal study in Edinburgh. They're really demonstrating to us that there are significant risks, even of benign interventions within families, particularly when children are younger. And so what a lot of this research is now showing us is that we should move away from this kind of targeted, preemptive interventions and be really focusing on universal developmental programs. Because, we talk about risks and the risks of poverty, but then we have this situation in New Zealand where 12% of children lack 7 attributes of daily life, like not having 2 pairs of shoes, not having a warm coat, not being able to do sports or external activities. 7% of children are in severe poverty. We have these, and I know our current government is attempting to deal with those things, but we're also still propelling this very clear risk, preemptive, targeted approach towards particular children and particular families. And we can see how that's going to play out effectively in sustaining the contact between Maori and Pacifica children and families and state care. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm conscious of the time,
Yeah.
And I know that there's a final section in terms of legacies of care abuse and long-term impacts, and I just wondered if you might share a couple of points from that, but in particular perhaps the quote that you have at paragraph 47 of the brief, which encapsulates that quite well. Yeah, I think the main some of the material in that section is really detailing the psychological impacts and the stress and the lack of self-esteem and all the anger and lack of trust and everything else that care leavers emerge with, and all of that really feeds into the difficulties of disclosure and that is, the difficulties of disclosure in just getting up here and telling people of what's happened. Also, difficulties of disclosure in just for family and friends. But so there's kind of whether or not you can disclose is an issue. But beyond that, victims often talked about how trying to really articulate what has happened to them is almost impossible, and how the language that you need to say what's happened to you, well, we just don't have the language for it either. So Peter explained it very well to me. He said, you can't get the impact of years and years of abuse, isolation, solitary confinement, stigma, degradation, self-loathing, everything. You can't get that. All those hours and days and weeks of sitting there looking at walls,
wondering, when you're a child, what you did so wrong, wondering why people don't care about you, how you did something for the world in general to loathe you so much, you know. The nights of crying yourself to sleep and missing your family, the pain and the separation, just everything. And then on top of that, the abuse from the people that were living with you and were supposed to be looking after you. And for that to go on for years and years and years.
Professor Stanley, there are many more questions I would like to ask, but it's only proper that I bring this to a close at this stage to allow our commissioners to ask some questions if they have some as well. But could I thank you at this stage for your evidence today? And Mr Chair, I should note that Council have indicated that they don't have questions for this particular witness. So there is
Thank you,
a
Ms.
small amount
Starmer.
of time available to commissioners.
Thank you. It's then a matter of asking colleagues if they wish to ask Professor Stanley any questions. Can I commence by asking you, Dr. Aotearoa?
Tēnā koe, Dr. Stanley. I'm aware of the pressure of time. I'll just keep this brief. It could be a comment, actually, that I'm really interested in the Cara McVie work. It's astonishing that even a benign intervention would put children at risk. And so by that, would that include wraparound intensive services could still have this negative outcome?
Yeah, I think what the evidence is showing is that there's what is tending to be working best are universal support mechanisms. So where children are not in poverty for a start, but where you know, if interventions are made, it's at the family's request, or it's been done in terms of a very basically, it's not there isn't an ounce of coercion in there, because I think even a lot of our benign interventions are built on coercion, and are built on a focus of, well, this is in your best interest and this is going to be good for you and you're going to thank us for it in the end. Yeah.
Ka nui te mihi ki a koe. Thank you very much.
Judge Shaw?
Thank you, Dr. Stanley. That last question and answer resonates with me because it goes back to the beginning of your evidence when you characterised the treatment of children in these institutions in a way that I confess I hadn't thought of before, and that was that you said that they were trying to make these children something. In other words, from your account or from your interpretation, it seems that you think that however horrific we feel what they were doing it for a reason, make them harden up, deter them, stop them offending. So in a way that was coercive intervention as well. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the reason why these institutions were allowed to continue as they did was that we had narratives to explain away and to give us some comfort. So we can talk about treatment, or we can talk about, you know, well, we need you to harden up for the real world, or, you know, we need to discipline you because we can't have you like that. You know, there's all these kinds of different narratives that get layered over to allow us to legitimise these activities.
So do you think that these were like almost excuses for the way for the barbaric behaviour that was being meted out?
Yes.
Or we did it for their own good?
Yes. Yeah. Because once if you move away from that, then you're in a, where are you going to be?
Yeah, you're completely complicit, yes.
Yeah.
That's a very interesting aspect which I'm going to think about long and hard. Thank you very much for your evidence, Dr. Stanley.
Thank you. Ms. Alofiwai.
Thank you, Dr. Stanley. Talofa lava. I was really grateful for your evidence and interested also around your comments around universalism, because when you talk about universal programs, Plunkett comes to mind as a national universal program, and I think about the accessibility or the lack of accessibility by certain population groups. And so when you talk about in this context, I guess it's just a point of clarity. When we talk about kaupapa Māori programs and we're talking about a Pasifika program that has a focus on a cultural framework, would you consider those universal programs?
Of course, yeah. When I talk about universal, I'm not saying it's just this kind of Pākehā model that gets universally applied. It's actually really about more that there are equitable services and that are resonant and useful and all those things. Yeah.
Thank you for clarifying that, otherwise we'd just be doing what we're currently doing.
Thank you.
Mr Gibson.
A couple of questions, just following up again on the universalism. Is there something also about progressive universalism, and is there something about opting in versus opting out that you're alluding to in terms of coercion?
Oh, I'm not quite sure I get your question.
I suppose, are there degrees of universalism for different populations, and is the way we kind of avoid coercion, some services are bordering on compulsory, and some you do have almost an opt-out option as opposed to a sense of coercion?
Yeah, I think it's about the whole culture of interventions that I'm trying to drive at. And, like at the moment, we are kind of moving into this new world of preemption. So where we're identifying families, we're identifying children on account of what they may do at some point in the future. And that is... that seemed to be, it seemed to be the future of our interventions, and it's seen often to be kind of, this is a benign place to start. But that effectively relabels everybody, and we can see how the cards will fall on those things, and we will see, once you have, because these things are kind of tied to knowledge systems, monitoring systems, knowledge sharing systems, and so those things are very difficult to move away from. So I think that's kind of the point that I'm trying to get at, that we're moving, even though we're moving away from a language of targeted and social investment approaches, we're still replicating a very similar type of model, and I think that's a real worry.
And a last question, you talked about a culture of impunity, and mostly at an institutional level, but you also gave a system-wide picture and talked at times about some institutions not reporting up even. Is there a wider culture of impunity beyond the institutional level, or how would you describe it?
Yeah, of course, because that wider culture of impunity, so you weren't having institutions that were giving information upwards, but also we had very little in the way of oversight and monitoring bodies as well. So you might have situations where there were kind of 3 people running around all the kind of care institutions and community care to try and monitor them. Well, that's kind of impossible, isn't it? So there was also that kind of happening at the state level.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you.
That leaves me, Professor Stanley. I have one question, which is partly addressed to Ms Spellman. The paragraph number 1 and footnote number 1 refer to Professor Stanley's book, The Road to Hell, State Violence Against Children in Post-War New Zealand. Is it the intention that the book be produced by her as an exhibit?
No, Chair, it's not. Although I had discussed that hopefully with Professor Stanley, her publisher pointed out that that would not be something he would agree to. So that's why we've referred to passages from the book within the brief.
Would he be agreeable to selling it to us?
I'm sure we can make some copies available.
I can give you copies. Yeah.
Well, Professor Stanley, you may rest assured that amongst the Royal Commissioners, your book has been a required piece of reading before our public hearings, and it will remain until the last day a central document so far as our deliberations are concerned. And the thanks of the Royal Commission are due to you in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you.